for 72 hours, surrounded by the undead. Frank finds himself in the center of a nightmare, desperate to uncover the truth. Equipped with only a camera, the hunger for knowledge, and impeccable fighting skills. What or who could have caused this? There is only one man strong enough to survive this place and find the answers, no matter what the cost. Frank West, photojournalist. Willamette, Colorado, September 19th. Frank got word that something big was going down in the city, so he chartered a helicopter to get him in. Soon after landing on top of a vast shopping mall, he was approached by a well-groomed man. When Frank asked him about his experience in the mall, the man told him it was hell. Frank agreed, saying that he also disliked shopping. Frank grabbed a quick snapshot of him for reference before heading off into the mall. He had a good-hearted chuckle about something that he saw on the security cameras. Before locating a group of survivors barricading the entrance, there was an old man in charge that told him that most of the city folks had turned into zombies, and they were barricading the entrance for safety. Frank noticed that hardly anyone was actually helping with the barricade, and rather they were just standing about instead. Then, out of nowhere, an old and frail woman blasted through the defenses with ease, letting in a great number of the undead. Frank was surrounded. He needed to get to the stairs and out of danger fast. Thankfully, he managed to make it past the zombies with his peak agility and speed. Back at the security office, he was the only one who had made it out and was quickly questioned about the other survivors. Frank couldn't be certain about what happened, so he thought it best to play dumb about the entire situation. In the room was a man and a woman, and someone who was clearly a mall manager named Otis. It was obvious to Frank that he would need to assert his dominance over the man. He had a very cool mustache and it made Frank rather insecure. Just then, the man bravely climbed into the ventilation shaft in hopes of getting back into the mall, and Frank knew that he had met his match. To make himself feel better, he showed the lady some pictures of his cat, and she told him her name was Jessie and the man's name was Brad. The mall manager, Otis, gave Frank a map of the mall and a radio so that he could bother him all the time. Then Frank crawled out of the vents. He was immediately met with a rather fat and old zombie, which he dispatched effortlessly. Then he came across a woman nearby looking for her husband, who she described as fat and old. Frank told the lady, whose name was Natalie, that he would bring her to a safe place, then proceeded into the dangerous zombie-filled shopping mall. He was ambushed by what he thought was a zombie, but before he could unload his fury on it with a fire extinguisher, he noticed it was only Jessie. She was on her way to help Brad with a gunfight that he was participating in. She then completely faked a leg injury and acted like she could barely walk, so Frank disarmed her and sent her back to the security room. Frank then immediately ran through the mall, firing off all the bullets in her gun before heading to help Brad with his gunfight. Brad couldn't have been happier to see Frank. It was clear that Brad was frightened, and that made Frank feel a bit less insecure about his mustache. The well-groomed man from the helicopter pad was shooting at them, and Frank needed to close the distance. Frank and Natalie ambushed the gunman. Frank delivered well-placed kicks and punches, and Natalie wailed on him with her frying pan. Realizing he was outmatched, the well-groomed gunman retreated into the rafters. After seeing Frank's immense display of power and strength, Brad acted like he had no interest in working with Frank. That was until Frank showed him the pictures he took of the gunman's crotch, which could help ID the suspect. That was when Brad realized just how good of a journalist Frank truly was. He was immediately on board with working together. Then Brad opened fire on Frank out of nowhere and completely unprovoked, and Frank had to go for the knockout. After the tussle, everyone knew that Frank was stronger, even if he didn't have a mustache. Later that day, Frank stumbled upon a couple of guys barricaded inside a store. He busted his way in to say hello, and immediately the guy started attacking him with a baseball bat. Frank had to defend himself, so he used his expert wrestling moves to dispatch both of the assailants. finishing one of them off with a beautiful suplex. Soon after, Frank heard a woman crying nearby. However, when he went to help her, she attacked him as well. Frank saw red and began kicking. Why was everyone so hostile toward him when all he wanted to do was recruit them so that he could force them to protect him? Natalie puts her life in jeopardy without question for Frank, so why wouldn't others, he thought. Frank was walking through the park feeling a little sad about all the murders he had just been forced to commit. Just then, a group of escaped inmates drove up and started harassing him. Frank had no choice but to take them out with his perfect taekwondo maneuvers. Frank located a woman that the inmates were targeting, and she joined his team. All that fighting and bloodshed, Frank really just needed some quiet time to himself for a while. He told the ladies to guard the entrance of a toy store for him while he played with Legos. However, unfortunately, they did a lousy job of it and were quickly torn to shreds. Thankfully, Frank still found a way to laugh and unwind. Just then, Otis interrupted to tell Frank that the ride in Wonderland Plaza was out of control. That's when Frank knew he had made a terrible mistake. All the good toy stores were in Wonderland Plaza. Frank arrived excitedly, eager to get on the Space Rider. Suddenly, a clown showed up. He was sad and crying and was going on and on about not being funny anymore. Frank had enough of his whining. He cornered the clown and began wailing on him over and over. Then the clown died of a fatal chainsawing accident, and it was time for Frank to finally go for a ride. He turned off the machine, and that was when he saw him. The most handsome and manliest looking man that Frank had ever had the pleasure of laying his eyes on. His name was Greg, and he was a mall manager just like Otis. Frank immediately felt better about the deaths that had happened and knew that him and Greg would soon be the best of friends. Frank was filled with excitement about everything, so much so that he began showing Greg his awesome wrestling moves. Greg was thrilled and touched by what Frank had shared with him and showed Frank a secret shortcut through the mall. While Frank and Greg were headed to the supermarket, they came across a scared and hurt old man named David. He told them that some crazy person at the grocery store had attacked him. Frank assured him that he would bring him somewhere safe. Then they all headed toward the grocery store where he was just attacked. Frank wanted to get Greg his favorite foods there, so that Greg knew how much he meant to Frank. And while they were shopping, David unfortunately fell into a group of zombies and got devoured. After the grocery store, it was time for Frank to get Greg some guns. Unfortunately, there was a drunk hillbilly protecting them, and he meant business. Frank moved in for a good old-fashioned fist fight, but couldn't land any significant punches on him. The hillbilly had impeccable wrestling throws. After realizing he was losing the fight, it was clear to Frank that he was going to need to pull out his secret weapon. From behind the desk, Frank hocked acidic spit at the hillbilly over and over until reality sunk in that he was losing a gunfight to a man spitting on him. The hillbilly quickly ran away crying. Now Greg was armed, fed, and feeling top-notch. Frank and him took out some more escaped prisoners in the park for fun, and Frank showed off some of his skateboarding skills. They were having a truly delightful time. Frank was called by Brad, who needed backup to save a person of interest named the Professor. He was believed to know more about what caused the zombie outbreak, and there was no time to waste. When they arrived at the location, it was a trap from the well-groomed gunman, who had strung up the Professor and was shooting at them with a sniper rifle. Brad went upstairs to distract the gunman, while Frank and Greg cleared out the zombies around the Professor. Frank then attempted to knock down the Professor with heavy objects, without success. Joining the fight, Frank was able to land some hits on the gunman, and it looked like they had it in the bag. Then Greg moved in, and before Frank could come to his side, Greg was shot dead. Frank was distraught. He didn't even have time to process it. He needed revenge this minute. Frank's fury heightened his reflexes, rolling past the gunman's attacks and landing strike after strike. Seeing the rage in Frank's eyes, the gunman retreated like a coward. Brad was shot, and they needed to get back to the security room fast. Frank didn't even have time to mourn Greg before he was carrying Brad and the Professor away. Greg was dead. A friendship so beautiful taken away so cruelly. Frank was beside himself and decided to go mourn Greg the only way he knew how, by vandalizing the grocery store. He knew Greg would have wanted it, and that he is looking down on him and smiling right now. Frank was feeling better, and it was time for him to get the medication Brad urgently needed for his wound. Then he heard someone else in the store and moved to investigate. It was the manager of the grocery store, and he looked pretty pissed off about all the vandalizing that Frank had done. Frank was forced to defend himself by tossing jugs of oil at him and chugging as much free milk as he could. Then Frank laid into him with a flurry of punches the manager would soon regret. After the fight, Frank headed back to the security office to give Brad his meds when he heard a bunch of people calling for help. When Frank entered the store to investigate, he found a large man holding a knife and looking for a fight. The man was no match for Frank, who rocked him with 2 solid hooks. While the man was dying, he talked of his military days and how the zombies made him go crazy. Frank felt bad for knocking him dead and wanted to honor him. Frank took his knife and finished off his captives for him. It was the least he could do for a veteran, he thought. After dropping off the meds to Brad, Frank went to get something to eat at one of the restaurants, where he found a rather fat man who had eaten all the food in the restaurant. The gentleman then started getting rude and wanted Frank to give up any food he had on him. He had been through too much, and losing Greg was still fresh on his mind. Frank was in no mood for disrespect, so he tore out the gentleman's guts in protest. Back in Wonderland Plaza, Frank came across an inappropriate police officer who had kidnapped a bunch of ladies. Frank burst in like a hero and took out the policewoman with heavy punches. After saving all the ladies, Frank was surrounded by scared and crying women, and he quickly became uncomfortable. He took the first chance he saw to ditch them and dove off the upper floor of the mall, then disappeared into the secret shortcut before they could find him. Frank came across a bunch of folks having a good old-fashioned cult sacrifice, and before he could get some good photos of the event, they got upset and began attacking him. After wailing on them with his fists, he freed their captive so that they could go play soccer. Unfortunately, she was not a strong athlete. Later that day, Frank was in the North Plaza when he came across a lady. When he asked her if she wanted to be pals, she hopped on a motorcycle and proceeded to try and run him down, sometimes opening fire on him with a pistol when she had distance. She was trying to kill him and left Frank with no choice but to deliver a gorgeous roundhouse straight to her face. She crashed her bike, and Frank moved in for the finish. Before he could lay into her with some serious ground and pound, she told him that she was the well-groomed gunman's sister, and she could get him to meet somewhere. Frank let her up. This was his chance to get his revenge for his beloved Greg. She told him that her name was Isabella, and that his name was Carlito. Frank pretended that he only wanted to talk peacefully about a news story, and definitely did not want to mercilessly kill Carlito in revenge for Greg, and they agreed to meet up at midnight. Frank had some time to kill until midnight, so he took Isabella's motorbike for a spin. After that, he rode the Space Rider in Wonderland Plaza for a while. Before heading over to Entrance Plaza, he beat the piss out of a group of snipers. Frank found a couple more ladies and a man, suplexing the man to show off his strength and force before ditching them and leaving them for dead. He was meeting with Isabella and Carlito after all, and didn't need the extra baggage. The time was close, and revenge was in sight for dear Greg, but when Isabella showed up, she was Carlito less, and had a fresh gun wound from him. While Frank rushed her back to the security room, he ran into a man armed with a shotgun named Kendall. They all headed into the courtyard, where they were met with another group of escaped inmates. Frank wasn't fast enough, but he had to get Isabella to safety. Kendall decided to stay and hold them off for him. It was a close call, but after dropping Isabella off to safety, Frank was able to rescue him. Kendall showed his strength, and Frank thought maybe, just maybe, Kendall could be his new Greg. While showing Kendall his fighting skills on the cult leader, Kendall stood near the back of the theater. Then, when it was all over, and Frank approached Kendall to receive his praise and admiration, a zombie snuck up on him and tore him to shreds. It was Frank's punishment for trying to replace such a perfect and pure man like Greg. Frank freed all of the captives, and then heroically escorted them all safely back to the security office, where they would definitely survive. Back at the office, it is revealed that the source of the zombie virus was from a scientific mistake while trying to mass-produce beef. Carlito was getting revenge for an outbreak that had happened in the past and was covered up. The professor was then eliminated as he was getting far too handsy with Jesse. Isabella then decided to let everyone know that Carlito was now going to blow up the mall, thus sending the virus into the atmosphere. Frank had enough of Carlito. He was furious at this point, bloodthirsty for revenge. He headed straight into the zombie-infested tunnels and grabbed one of the bombs. Then Frank lured Carlito to a secluded area. Once Carlito showed up, Frank went ballistic on him, causing him to retreat again. Frank's car was totaled, so he skateboarded after Carlito like a madman. Frank was ending this once and for all. This time, when Carlito returned, Frank cornered him and started landing endless punches through the window. Carlito was hurt bad and crashed trying to flee. In his thirst for revenge, Frank had forgotten about the bombs, but was reminded by Brad.
I'm gonna go after him. You get those bombs outside, Frank.
Frank got straight back to task and collected the bombs. In the nick of time, he got them out of the mall and completely saved the day. He immediately got into a car and headed back to find Carlito. When he arrived, he found Brad. He had been defeated by Carlito even after Frank had basically caved in his head with punches. Brad was infected and offered Frank his gun to give him a dignified death. Frank waited for him to turn, then tore out his guts as one last show of dominance over his superior facial hair. While Frank was returning to the security office, he ran into a guy pranking people with Molotov cocktails. Frank always loved a good practical joke. Then the guy slipped on a can of fuel and lit himself on fire. While Frank was trying to figure out how to aim the fire extinguisher, he accidentally threw it at his face. Frantically, Frank tried kicking the fire out, but unfortunately the man perished in the flames. Frank extinguished the survivors to be safe, and they joined his team in appreciation. Frank returned to the security office, and Isabella said she would show Frank where Carlito was hiding out. Frank gave Jesse a plant to say sorry about Brad's disembowelment, then headed outside to Isabella. His team was waiting for him, and Isabella refused to bring them all along to the hideout. Isabella insisted that Frank get rid of them before they continue, and gave no leniency. Frank took them all out horrifically, and she was satisfied enough to go. Revenge was on Frank's mind again, so he painted Isabella with some war paint to get in the mood for a fight. She looked pretty upset about it, but it was necessary. When they arrived at Carlito's hideout, however, he was nowhere to be seen. Then Jesse called him with a lead on Carlito. She saw him getting dragged into the meat shop in the basement of the supermarket. Frank ran like the wind. Carlito was his. When he got to the meat shop, there was a huge man that had hung up Carlito and was about to process him for meat. Although that would be funny to watch, Frank wanted to finish him off for himself. The man was reluctant, but after an intense negotiation, he peacefully gave Carlito up. Frank finally got to confront Carlito about shooting Greg. Carlito had a fresh gunshot wound that was likely a parting gift from Brad. Then he started rambling on and on about his reasons and justifications for his actions before Frank had heard enough and silenced him with a series of heavy kicks. There would never be any justification for Greg's death. Greg was Frank's best friend, and his death was now avenged. All that was left for Frank to do now was to wait for the helicopter to show up, then return home. On the way back to the security office, Frank received a call from Jesse, stating that the military was coming to clean up. They would kill everything and everyone who was left, then cover up the entire incident. When Frank got back to the office, there were 2 dead Special Forces members and a zombified Jesse. Frank had no choice but to judo throw her across the room. A note from Otis read that he had stolen the helicopter that the Special Forces came in on and left in a hurry because he had to return home and feed his cats. Frank decided to steal one of the Special Forces outfits as a disguise just in case. Then he waited for his escape to arrive. Several hours passed while Frank was waiting on the helicopter pad for his escape. Then just as his ride was approaching to carry him away to safety, he watched as the pilot was torn into by a zombie. The helicopter then crash-landed in the courtyard of the mall. Frank was trapped. There was no way he could escape the mall now. His only salvation had exploded in that courtyard. Frank collapsed. Awoken several hours later to Isabella, she had saved him and brought him to Carlito's hideout. However, she explained that Frank collapsed because he must have gotten himself infected somehow. Frank was shocked by the news. She told Frank that she had a way to suppress the transformation, but she needed supplies. Frank had a list: first aid kit, blender, coffee filters, a camp stove, a bottle of developing solution, a generator, and finally 5 adult bee queens. Frank hit them all like a man on a mission. The special forces saw right through his disguise for some bizarre reason and immediately opened fire on him, forcing him to go hands-on with them. He was fighting for his survival now. There were no more games. He ripped through the mall like a savage animal, taking the supplies he needed. No one could stop him from getting out of this mall and telling Greg's story. No one. His movements were perfect, and he was a well-oiled killing machine. Like a storm, Frank swept through every room, taking with it whatever he wanted. This mall didn't belong to the special forces or the zombies. It belonged to Frank West, photojournalist. After a frantic race, Frank had everything he needed and just had to grab the generator. His helicopter that crashed in the courtyard had opened up what looked to be a tunnel that possibly led to an unguarded way out. Frank returned to the hideout and Isabella synthesized the suppressant. Frank had more time now. He told Isabella about the tunnel, and she concocted a pheromone to keep the zombies away while they made their escape. Frank, however, had other plans. He had picked up something from one of the Special Forces members and couldn't wait to test it out. After blasting through the tunnel, they found a vehicle. Their escape was almost made when suddenly a tank came out of nowhere and crashed their vehicle. It was the commander of the Special Forces cleanup crew. After a brief talk about morality and some other things that Frank wasn't really listening to, the commander's tank auto-aimed on an incoming horde, and Frank took the opportunity to close the distance. A good old-fashioned one-on-one fist fight. Just what Frank loved most. The commander didn't even stand a chance. It was honestly pathetic. Frank unloaded on him, then tore out his guts and tossed him to the zombies. It was flawless. Everything Frank had been through had turned him into a warrior. He cried a battle cry like no man had cried before, and just under the deafening sound, you could hear the name, Greg. Thank you for watching. Press the like and subscribe buttons if you are feeling top-notch. Cheers.